Welcome back to WorldDenver Talks. Dr. Hashemi from Korbel School at University of Denver. Thanks very much. Let's talk about leadership in Syria and other countries that are experiencing conflict and change. Where are the individuals who could pull the Syrian rebels together? And I mean, who's their George Washington?
Well, I think the correct answer is that there is no one unifying figure like a Mandela, like a Gandhi, like a George Washington, who can bring the Syrian people together in a post-Assad sort of era. And I think that's also a good thing. And it's a good thing because there is a very brutal legacy of individual leaders coming to power and staying in power. Much of the Arab Spring, much of the protests over the last year and a half have been directed precisely against the idea of this omnipotent figure, a military person who's been in power, or his son has been in power for decades, and a strong aversion and repulsion and an attempt to sort of move to a new era where political legitimacy, where political unity is entrenched in a different set of values and ideas than the one charismatic leader. I mean, look at all of the key figures who've sort of been pariah figures in the context of the Arab Spring, the Gaddafis, the Mubaraks, who was in power for 3 decades and then he was about to anoint his son as his successor. I mean, in the case of Syria that we're talking about, it's Hafiz Assad who comes to power in 1970, stays in power, and then hands over the country effectively to his 34-year-old son at the time. And so there's an attempt to break away from that history and sort of move it to a new sort of more democratic, open era.
What signals would you look for that the rebels are being able to work in a more unified fashion, if not the emergence of a single leader?
There's been some coordination. There is an upper echelon sort of command that exists in Turkey. And what they have in common is, their opposition to the Assad regime. And you're right to indicate that this poses huge challenges in the post-Assad era. I mean, how are these groups, all of them armed, going to put aside their arms and agree to work on some sort of framework?
These rebel forces have to work together to get the job done, right? I mean, to remove Assad from leadership. That,
I think, lack of, unity among the Syrian rebel forces does actually pose huge challenges in terms of how to fight this war and how to overthrow the Assad regime.
And is that disunity, is that a cause for the lack of Western support, or is it an excuse for the lack of Western support?
The lack of Western support, I think, really has to do with a simple fact that there is no perceived immediate threat to Western geostrategic interests in the area. And so despite the huge loss of life, what Amnesty International has accurately called as ongoing crimes against humanity by the Assad regime against its own people, there's going to be no Western intervention that I can see in the foreseeable future, largely because there is a strong belief that there's no immediate threat to Western interests in the region. So sadly, it seems like for the foreseeable future, the Syrian people are left to themselves.
Is it inevitable, do you think, the fall of the Assad regime?
No, it's not. I think this regime, sadly, and I say this sadly, has a lot of staying power. It has the military advantage over the rebel forces for the reasons that I just mentioned. It has the heavy weapons, the arms, an air force. The other side does not. And it also has, unfortunately, a percentage of loyal support within the country, largely because of its manipulation of sectarian divisions.
What did Assad do for Syria? What could a Syrian person point to that might be a positive?
A lot of people are going to look back on the Assad era and say, well, yes, he was a brutal dictator and a tyrant and a kleptomaniac, but at least there was political stability. It was stable. There was a sense that even minorities were better off in Syria than in other parts of the Arab Islamic world. So perhaps if one had to sort of point to one aspect of the Assad regime, one can point to that aspect. But of course, I think one can't, objectively separate the Assad regime from its broader sort of reign of tyranny, and also its manipulation of sectarian tensions and the feelings and the sentiments of minorities to perpetuate the rule of the Assad regime. So I'm very reluctant to sort of speak positively of the Assad regime given really the horrendous track record.
So in the scenario that the rebels do not win, what then?
Well, I think one of the scenarios that scares me the most is what's often called the Algeria scenario. Most people don't know this, but in 1991, 1992, there was a democratic opening in Syria, in Algeria. There were elections. It seemed like the opposition were to come to power. Then there was a military crackdown. And what happened is, from 1992 to about 2002, a civil war broke out, where the Algerian military was able to, through a campaign of brute force and a scorched earth policy, crush the opposition, and in the process, the sort of acceptable figures are about 150,000 to 200,000 people were killed in Algeria, and the regime survived. It perpetuated itself. There was no external intervention. There was no support for the rebels. The regime survives until today.
We're looking at Iraq and Afghanistan, where it's not clear yet what the outcome is of that costly intervention is going to be.
It doesn't look good when you sort of look at do the calculation in terms of not only the dollars that were spent, but what did the United States actually get out of that huge expenditure of armaments, of money, and what's the net result? I mean, Iraq does not look very good. Afghanistan, looks even worse, and there's a sense that when the U.S. troops, NATO troops pull out, there's a deep sense that the Taliban are going to come back to power, which raises the question: what were we doing there for the last 11 years?
Do you have hopes that the situation would be given another look in January?
Possibly. I think if Obama gets elected again, it's a completely new sort of set of calculations. I think he can take more risks. But my assessment is that not a lot will change. I think the arguments that will again come up is that, look, there is no pressing, vital U.S. national interest that's at stake. If the conflict continues to spin out of control, if it starts to incorporate and take in Lebanon, if Turkey gets involved or Turkey becomes destabilized, if Jordan, for example, which is another bordering country that has taken in thousands of refugees, then there's a situation where the entire Middle East is being destabilized because of this regime, and that might force the Obama administration to reassess.
What if the election goes towards the Republicans, and what do you see President Romney doing in January?
I don't think that on the Syria question Romney will do anything different. I think Romney's foreign policy advisors, if you listen to them, they are deeply obsessed with Iran. So I suspect that if a Romney presidency does come about, the first sort of action by a new Republican president would be to support or to engage in some sort of military strike against Iran's nuclear program, which would then unleash, most likely, a regional war, and thus resulting in Syria being completely forgotten, because that will then be the big story, and that will be actually a dream come true for the Assad regime, because the focus will be on Iran. Iran will retaliate, and the Syrian regime will then be able to, continue its persecution of its own people, and will likely sort of perpetuate its military campaign against the opposition. So I don't see anything really happening on the Syria file, despite some of the rhetoric that you hear from some elements, including Romney himself, that U.S. leadership is weakened here under Obama. He hasn't done enough. I don't think there's going to be any shift on the Syria question should Romney get elected.
So last question is on the other democracy in the region, Israel. What actions has Israel taken with respect to Syria? Are they supporting the rebel groups? Do they see an interest in ending this conflict quickly?
Not really. There's no evidence that Israel is involved in any serious or significant way with respect to the question of Syria and the war in Syria. Largely because if you look at it, I think Israel has been quite happy with the Assad regime. Not that it likes the nature of the regime and its rhetoric, but the reality is that with the border that Israel shares with Syria, it's been a fairly stable border. The Assad regime has kept that border quiet, has respected the terms of the armistice agreement, and there's been no trouble for Israel. It also, I think, fears that if Assad will go, that you will have these religious nationalist Muslim Brotherhood elements that would come to power in Syria, that will be much more vocal and critical of Israeli policy in the region, that will be supportive of the national aspirations of the Palestinians, and that will pose a greater challenge to Israeli policy in the region.
So tell us again the name of your center at Korbel.
It's called the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School. It's in the process of being, set up, and hopefully we're going to try and put the University of Denver on the map in terms of the teaching, discussion, debate with respect to the contemporary Middle East.
Very exciting, and thank you very much for bringing your expertise to WorldDenver Talks.